Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Takedown, Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids series of unfiltered conversations about tobacco and advocacy within communities most impacted by the tobacco industry. My name is Nikkya Taliaferro, a former Youth Advocate of the Year and an intern with the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids. As a current Howard student, I'm excited to be talking with two Howard alums, Ed Sanders and Kelly Hawkins. Ed and Kelly, thank you for joining us today on The Takedown. Today, we'll be talking about the recent victory in California, where voters just overwhelmingly upheld the state's landmark law ending the sale of flavored tobacco products, including flavored e-cigarettes, menthol cigarettes, and flavored cigars. First, congrats on the big win. There were so many groups and partners that contributed to this campaign, proving that a strong coalition can stand up to big tobacco. Can you talk a little bit about your roles in this victory?
Sure, I'll jump in. Kai, thanks for having us. First off, just a pleasure to see a bison coming along in the fight to save our country from the ills of tobacco. Coalition-wise, it's an important part of any political movement, and any political process requires the building of a coalition so that you've got a consensus, so that policy leaders understand that it's sound, that people are educated on the issue. And it's the right direction to go. My role in the campaign was largely advisory, where starting to figure out messaging on how we talk to various communities. In California, it's one of the more diverse states in terms of populations, and how you reach those particular populations and what you say to them is certainly nuanced across histories and cultures. And so a lot of the work I do is in that regard. I've worked on policy campaigns and electoral campaigns as part of my work history, and happy to apply those skill sets to this effort.
And Nikkya, thanks for having us. We're really excited to talk about this work. My role was really focused in on engaging with our elected officials, really looking at where did we have champions that have been fighting the good fight, but in some cities alone, and just needed some new allies. And so really identifying who those individuals could be, specifically starting with LA County, and then really moving out to some of the 88 cities and seeing where we could really create a narrative that this was a regional push to end the sale of flavored tobacco.
Part of the fight in California was, it was sort of three-pronged, right? You had federal actions going on with the FDA. In the state legislature, there was a law moving forward. And then locally, we were passing ordinances at the local level. And so a number of us came into this fight on, depending on where you engaged. Kelly and I both engaged from the local level, but then once it moved into a state campaign, after the referendum was called, a lot of work in that regard. And then certainly as the FDA started taking action, we found ourselves continuing the fight along those lines as well.
Thank you for sharing. I can see a lot of work really went into the win that happened in California. Obviously, this victory is fantastic news for California's kids and public health, but it should also encourage other cities and states across the country to follow suit. As these campaigns kick off and heat up, what advice would you give to advocates and campaign leaders?
I think I would start, one, I think this is sound policy first off, right? When you look at the goal here, it's well-founded, it's rooted in scientific research. So this isn't, you're trying to convince someone based on scientific evidence. And that's sort of the first piece. What you're overcoming is a lot of different arguments, right? And I think one of the things that I would highlight that I know brought me into the fight, and Kelly as well, was certainly the way this coalition brought the fight against menthol and brought it together with the fight against flavored tobacco around vaping. That was an important element, and it was two things. One, it was where the opposition focused, right? Because from a messaging standpoint, the idea of protecting kids, that was a very easy conversation with policy leaders and people, right? They typically got it. The only folks that had trouble with that were, sort of independent minded, I would say males that wanted their vape, right? But even that group, in understanding what the industry was doing in terms of its targeting, quickly understood from a public health standpoint, we need to remove flavored tobacco. The menthol side was really where this fight was won. And it challenged so many conceptions and just sort of old historic beliefs, one about the African American community, but more importantly, how the broader coalition viewed African Americans. And it's one of the things that I think I'm most proud about this coalition for is sticking by the fight to get rid of menthol, because at any point they could have cut that loose. And that was a very important strategy and very important fight that we continued. And truthfully, we won it on that point, right? When you understand what the way the tobacco industry targeted the African American community, and once you see that and understand that it wasn't just some decades old fight, that this went back to the days of slavery where tobacco plantation owners expressed providence over the African American body, and you could see how the marketing grew from that. Once we started explaining that to people, they really started to understand that this industry isn't on the up and up. And when you start looking at how they were treating kids, it really made sense. And so, I know for Kelly, we had this conversation when we first started, came on board, and it was one of the fueling points. But I should let you chime in there as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think historically, yes, we've been a target, but I think given that we, Ed and myself Ed was the campaign manager, and I was one of the advocates that they brought on to support the work, I do think that it was important for communities of color to see advocates and leaders within the campaign that looked like them. That then they knew this wasn't about people just getting a paycheck to do the work. This was individuals that had lived experience, right? I myself, public health practitioner turned advocate, and working in a government affairs role, really can bring that credibility to the role, understanding the impact to our community as a whole. I think the other part that the other states and communities should think about is it will be easy to get wrapped up in the latest news story that then derails your message of ending the sale of flavored tobacco and really protecting the health of our communities. Yes, youth are a critical component of that because we all see that so many youth get hooked so early, but this is really a community health conversation. And when we take it in that context, I think we were able to get a lot further and not get wrapped up into, well, this is about another issue. This is about, how law enforcement engages with African Americans. No, this is about protecting the health of our community.
Yeah, someone as an advocate as well, I definitely see the difficulty in trying to ensure that our messaging stays consistent. It doesn't really stray, especially because of the intersectionalities just within advocacy. It's really hard to stay focused within public health. And I also understand the struggles of keeping menthol in legislation. There's been times and times again that our youth coalition had legislation that was going through, and then last minute menthol got taken out and we were no longer able to support the bills. So I definitely agree with both of your perspectives and trying to ensure that messaging is consistent and appropriate for what we're trying to do, and then also ensuring that everything that we're trying to advocate for remains in the legislation that we're trying to accomplish. But we've seen time and time again, the tobacco industry does everything it can to perpetuate cigarette sales and fight proven public health policies that would advance health equity. How do you stay motivated and energized to fight big tobacco?
Taking that good cup of Java every morning and starting the day. You just have to know that this is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And I think when we entered this work, none of us knew truly how long this fight would take in terms of these individual ordinances that were going to get passed at the local level. There have been so many, there's decades and decades of work that has gone into just getting us to that moment in 2019 to really push LA County forward. And when I say LA County, that's still not even including the 88 cities within LA County, right? And so how we, at least for myself and our team, we stayed energized and ready because we knew we had a North Star. The North Star for us was ending the sale of flavored tobacco. So there were very few distractions that could get us off our path. And I think what it did was help us actually sharpen our messaging when we did have distractions and detractors.
Yeah, I would definitely second all of that. When I look at it, I would also say that, elections matter, and we're just past the November election. And certainly every 2 years nationally, we're called to the ballot box, and it really does matter who you elect, because when you start to look at this fight, it's not just legislative, but it's also on the judicial side, right? So all of the work that we did around this campaign was challenged in the courts shortly thereafter. And 2 days ago, the Supreme Court denied tobacco's appeal to try to block the enforcement of Proposition 31. And so you could see how the conversation around judges and who gets appointed to the bench plays a role in this. The conversation around who you elect to Congress, who you elect to your state legislatures, plays a role in this. And this is, for us, this is one of these policies that actually saves lives. I mean, we can talk about potholes, you can talk about a number of different things. This is a policy that will actually save lives. And getting people to engage on that has always been a constant. I think for us, I know I played a role in Prop 56 a couple of years ago in 2016 on this fight, when we were, sort of incrementally targeting, or I should say incrementally on the fight, trying to raise revenue for education. And the best way to do that was to increase revenue through the sales of tobacco. So everyone that purchased a pack of cigarettes contributed to a fund that helped fund healthcare, and then also some of the education piece. And that education dollars, you could see it at work, and the progress as we came forward in this campaign. It's like those public safety campaigns. I don't think there's anybody that's watching this broadcast that doesn't get in a car, buckle their seatbelt, right? And for those of us of a certain age, that wasn't always the case. There was a period in time where you just didn't buckle your seatbelt, but public education brought you to that. And it's the same thing with understanding public health around tobacco use, and ultimately it played dividends on the electoral side.
I also think we had a very unique environment in 2020. Really, COVID changed the game in terms of how we were going to organize again, right? How do you organize in a remote environment, right? No one can come into council chambers or to county halls of administration. You couldn't go into the state house. Everything was now video or Facebook Live. And so or YouTube, so the level of engagement really shifted, but it also created a lot of opportunity, right? It created that opportunity for communities that might not be able to get off of work and go to a meeting in the middle of the day to actually advocate, right? Or so that they could still be at home with their families and still advocate on behalf of such an important issue, right? So just in terms of how do we stay focused when all this was going on? And really, truthfully, we, leaned into the message of community health as related to COVID and the impact that it would have on our communities accessing these products, and why, when you look at some of the underlying conditions of the impacts of COVID, the impacts to one's cardiovascular, pulmonary system, that in itself became a talking point, right? But again, not to let COVID take over the discussion, but it was an entry point for a lot of bodies of government. I think also what was interesting is a lot of folks thought the conversation would go on hold relative to passing some of these ordinances. Our state house passed our bill in the middle of COVID. So if we can get a monumental bill passed in a pandemic, the opportunities are enormous moving forward for communities, because we now have the playbook for how to get work done in a pandemic, outside of a pandemic, or whatever may come our way. So the focus, and I think lastly, how do we kind of maintain our charge and our fuel is as a team across the country, across the state, across the county, we had those regular check-ins to just really say, that was a really rough fight last night, or that was a really tough conversation. How are you feeling about that? And so that people don't feel so isolated and alone, right? So I think that team collaboration that we had working with advocates and especially our partners at TFK was great.
Yeah, I definitely agree that while COVID had a lot of its downfalls, it allowed for way more people to have access to activism in ways that they've never been able to have before. And that's definitely been shown by the amazing youth voter turnout that just happened in this most recent midterms. And it really shows that even though we had these struggles where everyone was online, it was able to connect a lot of people to public health that have never had access to it before. And that I definitely agree with your sentiment, Kelly, that having COVID really allowed for us to strategize in new ways and have other strategies and how we can connect to people that we've never been able to connect to before. As a Tobacco-Free Kids Youth Ambassador, we often talk about our why when describing how we get involved in our advocacy work. Personally, I first got involved in tobacco prevention after speaking on a youth panel about the importance of advocacy for my local youth tobacco coalition. What is your why that led you to the important work that you do today?
Sure, I'll start. Well, I've always been engaged in health care issues, prevention, intervention. I was pre-med at Howard, and really have always had that interest in supporting community and building a healthier community. But even more personally for me, my grandmother was a smoker pretty much the majority of her life until she was about 65, 70 years old. And when she finally did quit, it was only because they had to remove a portion of her lung. And you saw the impact to her breathing. She then had to rely on oxygen tanks. And when I say she was a chain smoker. And so I unfortunately had a front row seat to her demise as a result of her choices around tobacco. And, knowing that so many of our community members deal with that same addiction, it is really, what drives me every day to say, you know what, I know what the personal impacts of lung cancer, what they look like. I know the impact on one's family. I also know that I looked up to my grandmother. And that wasn't necessarily the part of role modeling that she was looking to put forward. But, my siblings and I have all tried cigarettes at some point. Why? Because we saw a role model that we looked up to smoking cigarettes. And so I think we have got to jump in and, change the narrative there. But she is really the reason behind the work that I do, especially around tobacco sell or anti-tobacco policy here in the work that I do.
So much of Kelly's story mirrors a lot of my story as well. And, having both of us grown up in Los Angeles and for me, it was my grandmother as well. And I can remember the Newports. I was, of the group that would ride up to the liquor store with the note in hand and buy a pack of cigarettes and take it back for her. They were ever present. And, I remember the last years of her life, and certainly the last weeks of her life where she was battling, emphysema more drastically in the hospital, and the pain of that, and you carry that, right? You carry that vision forward. And, I think as, I grew up and started to learn more about the tobacco industry itself, right? And I've always viewed the tobacco industry and its use of menthol as one aspect of systematic oppression. And, one funny element about this fight is, we were, battling or it was also at the forefront at the time of sort of the post-George Floyd protests, right? Where, there was this conversation around police brutality and more specifically how, law enforcement would take liberties with killing of African Americans throughout this country. And, that fight and that argument became center stage in our fight against, flavored tobacco. And, this is where one of these moments where, we're trying to explain, you get it on the far right, like you get where they're coming from, but having to explain it to our allies, trying to help them to understand, that systematic oppression is not just, the baton of a police officer. It is also an industry that is attacking our health in an unseen way, which is what menthol is doing. And so when I start thinking about my grandmother, I start thinking about, how much money she actually spent on cigarettes. And, she used to do the savings bonds, right? Every month or graduation at the end of the school year, my brother and I and cousin would get, savings bonds. And, you think back and it's like, wow, all the resources that she spent on cigarettes, you could have done something different with. And then you wonder, how much of this was really her fault? Because in truth be told, as we started to get more engaged in this, she started talking to more and more people, and you hear the stories of those that were in school, in middle school, and the white van would pull up and they'd have these tobacco giveaways, right? And the way the industry put it in people's hands. And you've done a lot of work with incarcerated people and helping them re-enter society more fully. And you see, not only are they struggling to acclimate back to society, but they've also picked up this habit of smoking, right? And there's sort of this currency of cigarette, and it plays this heavy role in their health, which ultimately plays a role in their outcomes. So staying motivated for us is just, part of our work, right? On any given day, any policy that I sign up to try to help, I think about it first from an aspect of, is this good for, the American people? But, more acutely, is this good for the African American communities that I try to stand up and support? So, yeah, how do you stay motivated? There's always work to be done, right? Like there is no final victory that, I think we're going to plant our flag down. We've always got work to do. So I think each day we get up and go to work.
Right. I think also, Nikkya, what's interesting is it's a rare opportunity that you get to advocate on behalf of issues that directly impact African Americans, right? Yes, the global community is absolutely important, but unlike big corporations or big tobacco that have folks running to go advocate on their behalf, because for whatever reason, maybe it's the check, maybe it's the reason, we don't necessarily have those advocates that can get the attention of the decision makers. And so I believe it is my responsibility as an advocate to make sure I leverage relationships with those decision makers, whether it's at the state house, whether it's locally with mayors or board of supervisors, that I leverage those relationships to make my communities better than I came into them.
Yeah, and something I wanted to highlight, Ed, that you said is the importance of trying to draw intersectionality amongst movements. And that's something that we really tried to emphasize when doing policing work, especially during 2020, like trying to draw like policing work and public health, and also how these things also connect to other areas of advocacy, like climate change, and how racism also ties into climate. And I think it's definitely important to draw these connections between each advocate group, because a lot of these issues directly affect the Black community. And if we're able to draw these intersectionalities amongst all of these different issues, we can draw people that we've never had access to before to a tobacco fight. And that's personally how I got drawn into. I was in policing and got moved into the health sector from someone showing me the intersectionalities amongst health and amongst racism. As I mentioned at the start of this conversation, all three of us are proud Bison. I'm in the middle of my sophomore year at Howard and studying political science with the hopes of becoming a civil rights lawyer. Looking back at your college and early career experience, what advice do you have for people my age who are eager to make an impact towards a better future?
Listen, it's a joy to talk to you about this, right? We couldn't be prouder to see you pulling together this show, this conversation. Howard was the best decision, outside of marrying my wife and choosing my wife that I could have made. It came at a time where post a different world, right, where there was this resurgence of applicants coming to HBCUs, and we consistently see how Howard rises to the forefront of conversations, whether it's a vice president going into the executive branch, or a Kelly Hawkins leading a fight to enact flavored tobacco. My advice to young people is this: you all have come at a point where technology is such a wide open space, right? You all have the ability to connect in ways that I simply can't. I without knowing you, my gamble is that you probably have 5,000 contacts on whatever platform that you're using, right? And that sort of connection to others is not something that I had coming out of college or even in that space. Also in that is information is actually more readily available to you. And I find myself now more curious about various topics than I was in college. I'll readily admit, Dre was dropping albums, Biggie was coming out. It was a great time on Howard's campus. Puffy had just been there. It was the golden age. But my curiosity about issues is greater now, and how I use technology to stay informed or find resources to better my understanding of issues is important. You all as young people have that opportunity. There's so many things that can be your North Star in this world, and you have the ability to be well informed about it, and then you also have the ability to connect with others to help inform them. And at the basis of that is how we would make change in this country, and you guys have an incredible opportunity in front of you.
Exact. I could not agree more with what Ed just said. I think just adding on to that, for those students that are, I'm going to just have a message real quick for the current Howard students. Don't miss the fact that you are on a campus with historical significance. And I have to say that was not something I plugged into until I was probably my last year at Howard. And you have an opportunity to make some of the greatest connections and relationships that will last you a lifetime, beyond one career over here or over there. You are in the nation's capital, and that's more of for the students that are studying right now in DC. Take advantage of the fact that this is probably the one time that you can work on the Hill for the limited compensation that they're able to provide. You have access. You don't understand how great your access is because you may not have explored that yet, but you are in a position to create your own kind of trajectory, because of the infusion of the internet and streaming. You can be an influencer, but you can also be the key influencer that now news outlets are calling because you have a following, but you also have a message, and a message of either hope or disruption, but you've got a message, and so you want to use that. This is your time to shine. This is your moment. Don't get into your, comfort zone where you're like, oh, I'm in my major. I understand the issue, similar to what you did, Nikkya. You saw an opportunity to really cross over into a topic that maybe you weren't as familiar with. be open, maintain a level of curiosity, and that level of curiosity will drive you to have a greater impact on not just your smaller communities, but the greater global community.
Yeah, thank you so much for those words of wisdom. I'm sure that was very helpful for students out there that are looking for next steps as far as career and educational goals. Ed and Kelly, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, and I know the advocates watching appreciate the valuable insight you shared today. Be sure to check out our other takedown conversations at tfk.org/C4TC. Thanks again. Hope you all have a great day.